In this video, we'll begin our study of the second sublecture, that is part 2 of the master lecture that spans Proverbs 25 through 29. By way of review, in the last group of videos, we studied the first sublecture, which we're entitling Introduction, Counsel for Kings and Courtiers in Quest of Magnificence. That spanned simply the first 12 verses of the first chapter in this sequence, chapter 25. By naming within that title Counsel for Kings and also Counsel for Courtiers, we're reminding ourselves that in the first sublecture, the sage launched a dual theme addressing these two identities, these two groups, realizing that together they were in quest of the most splendid realm or personal experience that they could possibly achieve, that is, magnificence. The second and fourth sublectures then expand on those two portions. And as you may recall from the earlier preview, the sage will turn to the second of the dual theme, namely courtiers, and let that occupy position 1 in the expansion, that is, the second sublecture. Then he will delay addressing Counsel for Kings until the fourth sublecture. So the title we're suggesting for the second sublecture is this: Counsel for Courtiers Expanded. Individual magnificence and the necessity to restrain greed, to refine generosity, and to prize reproof. This is a substantial sublecture spanning 25:13 and encompassing almost all of chapter 27, stopping at verse 22. Let's zero in on a few key portions of that title. First, the expression individual magnificence. Please notice how the fourth sublecture is titled Counsel for Kings Expanded, and then this, National Magnificence. When we come to the fourth sublecture, the sage's perspective will broaden to encompass the whole realm. We'll see him use the term people rather than individuals so much. He's interested in what is good for the well-being of the whole people. Here in the second sublecture, however, the focus is narrower. He's zooming in on individual leaders, leaders subordinate to the king within the kingdom. That's why we use this expression individual magnificence as the focus for the second sublecture. He's showing them how they, as individual courtiers, should conduct themselves if they are serious about attaining a status of magnificence. The particular lessons then that he impresses on the courtiers are these: restraining greed, refining generosity, and prizing reproof. We will want to watch for these three, greed, generosity, and reproof, as they parade across the sage's sublecture number 2 in succession. Here you see the first display of this second sublecture, Counsel for Courtiers. We'll want to begin by studying the links to the preceding context. In order to do so, let's put on the screen again the relevant portions from the first sublecture. Here you see the beginning of the first sublecture. We'll want to focus on section 2, part B, which you see in the lower right. Let's advance the page so that we can see more of this. In the left-hand half of the page, towards the bottom, you see the title for Unit 2B, Counsel for Courtiers. And we find there a dual theme that was embedded right here in the first sublecture. When the topic of counsel for courtiers appeared within the introductory sublecture, the sage there emphasized a combination of self-control concerning greed and shrewdness concerning generosity. And here we're concentrating on verses 6 through 10, thereof chapter 25. Now in this present second sublecture, the sage will develop each of these dual foci, and he will do so in the same sequence as found in the introduction. The lesson that teaches self-control concerning greed in the second sublecture will occupy block 1A, and that will span chapter 25, verses 13 to 28. This is the first block of the first section. Self-control concerning greed, that lesson will reach crystal clarity in the final verse of that block. That is verse 28 of chapter 25. It reads, "A city which has been breached has no wall. Such is a person who has no restraint over his spirit." As far as the lesson that teaches shrewdness concerning generosity in the second sublecture, that occupies the ensuing block, block 1B. That picks up with Proverbs 26:1 and continues on through 27, verse 4. The introductory sublecture closed with a quatrain concerning reproof, how both to effectively dispense reproof and how to properly receive it. This is located in chapter 25, verses 11 and 12. Let's advance the screen so that we can see this as well. Here you see it on the right, verses 11 and 12. Now the second sublecture similarly teaches, in expanded fashion, both how reproof ought to be dispensed and also how it ought to be received. The only change is these two components will reverse their order in the second sublecture. So then reproof received appears in the second sublecture in chapter 27, verses 5 through 10. On the other hand, reproof dispensed will appear right after that, chapter 27, verses 11 through 18. Together, these teachings on reproof occupy the second major portion of the second sublecture. We're labeling that section 2, Proverbs 27, 5 through 18. All that follows this teaching on reproof in the second sublecture is a 4-verse conclusion. That is 27, 19 to 22, and that wraps up the second sublecture. Now let's consider the links that join this second sublecture with the third and fourth. An illustration concerning effective management comprises the third sublecture that spans 27-23 through the end of that chapter, namely verse 27. This forms a bridge linking our second sublecture with the fourth. The fourth spans chapter 28 and 29, the entirety of both chapters. Within that bridge of the third sublecture, the sage calls for effective management, and he bases it on this rationale. Both wealth and crown are ephemeral in nature. Notice how he expresses this in chapter 27, verse 24, which again is part of this third sublecture. It reads, "For wealth does not last forever, and certainly not a crown from one generation to the next." The term crown alludes to the magnificence of a monarch, whom the sage will counsel in the fourth sublecture. The term wealth, here in 27:24, alludes to the magnificence accumulated by courtiers, whom the sage counsels in our second sublecture. Thus, the third sublecture, with this expression, "wealth does not last forever and certainly not a crown," is reaching both to the courtier teaching of the second sublecture and reaching forward to the king counsel of the fourth sublecture, supplying by this means a bridge between the two. Another link between the second sublecture and those that follow has to do with a rhetorical technique that we find there. It's found in the second sublecture and in the fourth. It involves this: delaying until the close of a given lesson the disclosure of paradoxical counsel related to that lesson. In the second sublecture, we find this happens in the following way. The avenue to attain glory for oneself, paradoxically, lies not in burnishing one's own reputation, but in pursuing the glory of another. This is expressed in chapter 25, verse 27. It's in our second sublecture, and it occurs toward the close of the lesson that spans block 1A, namely 25:13 through 28. Again, that target verse that talks about not burnishing your own reputation, but that of another, is 25:27, just one verse shy of the close of block 1A. This same rhetorical technique can be seen in the fourth sublecture in two occasions. First, the path to becoming well-nourished paradoxically lies not in expanding one's own appetite, but rather in relying on the Lord. This appears in 28:25 of the fourth sublecture. It's very close to the close of section 1. Section 1 closes in 28:27, and that paradoxical counsel is in 28:25, just two verses shy of the close. A second example from the fourth sublecture of this rhetorical technique is as follows. The path to improving one's lot lies not in anxiously scheming how one may get ahead by strategies of abuse that are spurred on by greed. And here we're targeting chapter 29, verse 25a. And here comes next in 25b, the paradoxical component. Instead, the sage paradoxically advocates divine trust. This teaching in 29:25 appears just two verses shy of the close of the entire fourth lecture. This teaching in 29:25 occurs just two verses shy of the close of the entire fourth sublecture. So these are some ways in which we find the second sublecture links to its ensuing context. In the next video, we'll turn to the second sublecture and read through the translation.